If you press charges, we're done. My wife threatened after I called 911 to arrest Stepson. I met her demand. Months later, I found records exposed what really happened. I'm a 42-year-old auto mechanic, and I've owned a small auto repair garage for almost 2 decades. The place isn't fancy, but it's mine. Life had been good, steady job, reliable income, and a modest but comfortable home that I'd managed to pay off through years of careful budgeting and hard work. A few years ago, I married Kate, a 39-year-old woman who came with an 18-year-old son, Jake. At first, Jake wasn't too bad. He was your typical teenage boy, distant, moody, and often at odds with the rules. But I chalked that up to normal teenage behavior. I made genuine efforts to connect with him. I'd invite him to hang out at the garage on weekends, thinking maybe he'd be interested in learning about cars. I tried teaching him basic maintenance, hoping it might give us common ground. I'd take him to get burgers at this local joint that made amazing hand-pressed patties, thinking maybe over food we could talk and bond. But no matter what I did, Jake wasn't interested. He would shut me down with contempt, roll his eyes dramatically, and act like I was some annoying intruder in his life. When Kate and I got married, things only got worse. His attitude shifted from mere teenage rebellion to outright hostility. Every attempt to establish boundaries or basic rules resulted in explosive arguments. Simple requests like asking him to let us know when he'd be home or to help with household chores were met with defiance and sneering comments. I couldn't understand why he was so hostile toward me, and when I would speak to Kate about it, she would always brush it off. "He's just being a teenager," she'd say, waving away my concerns. "You have to be patient with him." I tried, God knows I tried, but nothing ever seemed to improve. It got to the point where I would raise an issue, like him staying out until 3 a.m. on school nights or skipping classes, and Kate would rush to his defense before I could even finish speaking. It was like my voice didn't matter in my own home. Every conversation about Jake's behavior turned into Kate accusing me of being too harsh or not understanding enough. I started feeling like an outsider in my own family. I started thinking maybe it would get better when he turned 18, that he'd grow out of it or at least gain some maturity. But I couldn't have been more wrong. The real problem started unfolding months before his 18th birthday, when I began noticing small but unsettling signs that something darker was brewing. Tools would go missing from my garage, only to reappear days later in strange places. I'd find my expensive diagnostic equipment moved around, despite Jake claiming he never touched anything. Sometimes I'd come home to find the garage door slightly open, even though I was certain I'd locked it. At first, I dismissed these incidents as forgetfulness on my part. Working long hours can do that to you. But deep down, something felt off. It all came to a head on what started as an ordinary Friday night. I had been working late at the garage, dealing with a complicated transmission rebuild that had taken longer than expected. I was covered in grease and exhaustion, my hands raw from hours of detailed work, but all I wanted was a quiet evening at home. Kate was out with her friends for their monthly dinner club, and Jake was at home, supposedly enjoying his weekend. As I walked in, I noticed Jake sitting on the couch, making snarky comments under his breath. He had this look in his eyes, not just the usual teenage defiance, but something colder, more calculated. Normally, I would ignore him, but that night the tension in the air was palpable. When I tried to say a casual hello, he made a remark like, "You gonna ground me for breathing or what?" I told him to mind his attitude and went to my room to change, thinking maybe I was just tired and reading too much into it. My work clothes were soaked with sweat and grease, and I just wanted to wash away the day's stress. I went back to the living room, hoping things would calm down, but that was when things started to spiral. Around midnight, I heard noises coming from the garage. Not just regular movement sounds, but the distinct clinking of metal tools and the scraping of storage containers being moved. Jake had always been a bit of a rebel, so I figured he was just messing around, maybe looking for something to tinker with. But when I went to check, what I found made my blood run cold. Jake wasn't just going through my toolboxes, he was systematically pulling out specific items: paint thinners, acetone, old oily rags, and other flammable materials I kept for work. These weren't randomly selected items. This was a calculated gathering of the most dangerous materials in my garage. I kept these things properly stored and separated because I knew how volatile they could be. One spark near that combination of chemicals could trigger a devastating fire. I told him to drop everything and leave the garage immediately, but instead of listening, he rolled his eyes and muttered curses under his breath. There was no remorse, no sign that he understood the gravity of what he was doing. I could feel my frustration boiling over, but I let it slide, hoping it was just another teenage outburst. I went back inside, tried to reassure myself that he was just being a jerk, and attempted to relax, though my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. But I had no idea how close we were to disaster. Hours later, everything I feared came true. I had dozed off on the couch, my exhaustion taking over, when I was suddenly jolted awake by the unmistakable smell of smoke. Not just a hint, but thick, acrid smoke that made my throat burn. I jumped up, heart racing, and ran to the back door. There, in the dark of the yard, I saw flames licking at the wooden fence. The fire wasn't huge yet, but it was big enough to spread quickly, especially considering the dry conditions in the backyard and its proximity to my garage. Standing near the fire, grinning like it was some kind of joke, was Jake. He had positioned the fire strategically, close enough to the garage that it would eventually spread, but far enough away that he could claim it was just a backyard accident. I couldn't believe my eyes. He had a smug look on his face, like he was proud of what he had done. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I screamed, rushing to grab the garden hose. The flames were getting higher, and I could feel the heat intensifying. I fought to put the fire out, but my heart was racing, and the fear that something worse could have happened consumed me. If that fire had reached the garage with all the flammable materials inside, the explosion could have taken out not just my property, but neighboring homes as well. Kate had just returned home and came rushing outside, panicked when she saw me spraying the fire. But her first instinct wasn't to check if I was okay or to even apologize for what had happened. No, her first words were, "Is Jake okay?" I couldn't believe it. Here I was, fighting a fire that could have destroyed everything, and she was more concerned about the person who started it. "Of course he's okay. He's the one who started the fire," I shouted over the sound of the hose. But Kate, instead of acknowledging how dangerous the situation was, started pleading with me not to call the police. She wanted me to pretend it was an accident, to say he didn't mean for it to get out of control. She was more worried about Jake facing consequences than about the fact that he had deliberately tried to destroy our property and potentially put lives at risk. I couldn't do that. I couldn't ignore the fact that Jake had deliberately set fire to our yard, especially knowing now that it was part of a larger plan to destroy my livelihood. This wasn't some reckless mistake or a prank gone wrong. He had a clear intent, and I couldn't let it slide. I dialed 911, and within minutes, the cops arrived. They took Jake to the station, and the whole situation exploded into chaos. Kate was hysterical, blaming me for ruining our family. She said I was overreacting, that it wasn't that serious. But in my mind, this was a matter of life and death. If that fire had spread to the garage or the house, I would have lost everything, not just my home and business, but potentially lives could have been lost. The police investigation would later reveal just how close we came to disaster. His goal wasn't just to start a small fire, he wanted to destroy my garage completely. He knew that's where I kept all my important business documents, my expensive tools, and the classic car I'd been restoring for years. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy everything I'd worked for. The incident marked the end of my marriage to Kate, but it also served as a wake-up call about the dangers I had been trying to ignore. Sometimes, protecting yourself means making hard choices, even when family is involved. Update 1. In the following days, everything spiraled out of control. Kate became more and more distant, focusing all her energy on defending Jake and blaming me for pressing charges. I couldn't understand how she could protect him after what he did. My property was at risk, and yet Kate stood by her son, making excuses for his actions. I couldn't live like that anymore. I couldn't live with someone who refused to see the severity of what had happened. The tension at home was unbearable. Eventually, Kate gave me an ultimatum: drop the charges or she would leave. I couldn't and I wouldn't. This wasn't about me being stubborn. It was about holding Jake accountable for his actions, no matter who he was to me. Kate followed through on her threat. She filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. When she served me the papers at my garage, I was humiliated, but deep down, I felt a strange sense of relief. The last few weeks had been filled with anger, confusion, and exhaustion. I knew this relationship wasn't healthy anymore, and as painful as it was, I couldn't let my own safety and principles be compromised for the sake of keeping a family together. Update 2. Hi there, it's been a week since my last post, and the aftermath of Kate filing for divorce has been a whirlwind of emotions and legal proceedings. Even as I tried to cope with the dissolution of my marriage, I couldn't forget about Jake and what he'd done. I want to be clear, I didn't press charges because Kate filed for divorce. I pressed charges because what Jake did was dangerous and criminal, and he needed to face consequences. I hired a lawyer who specializes in both criminal and family law. During our first meeting in his downtown office, surrounded by law books and case files, he looked through the police report and photos of the fire damage. His assessment was direct. Given the evidence and the premeditated nature of Jake's actions, the state would likely pursue serious charges. This wasn't just teenage rebellion, he explained, leaning back in his chair. This was an attempted arson with clear intent to cause damage. Every day I dealt with a constant knot in my stomach. I truly loved Kate. We'd built what I thought was a good life together. But I also knew I had to stand my ground. If Jake faced no consequences for this, what would stop him from trying something even more dangerous next time? The stakes were too high to back down. When the case went to court, the fluorescent lights of the courtroom made everything feel surreal. I testified about what happened that night, my voice steady despite my nerves. The responding officers presented their report, complete with photographs of the fire damage and the collection of accelerants Jake had gathered. What struck me most was Jake's demeanor throughout the proceedings. He sat there smirking, occasionally rolling his eyes, showing absolutely zero remorse for what he'd done. His attitude made my blood boil. Kate refused to even look in my direction during the hearing. She sat rigid in her chair, all her energy focused on protecting Jake, even though the evidence of his wrongdoing was overwhelming. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, found more than enough evidence to proceed. She set bail, and Jake was kept in custody until it was paid. Kate's sister paid the bail, then cornered me outside the courthouse. "You're going to regret this decision," she hissed, pointing her finger in my face. "You're destroying our family." I told her to leave me alone. I was done being manipulated by their family dynamics. During this chaos, my lawyer asked about any pattern of dangerous behavior, which led to a shocking discovery. 6 months earlier, I'd installed security cameras around the house after a series of break-ins in our neighborhood. The cameras covered the garage, driveway, and backyard. I hadn't checked the footage regularly, but now I went back through months of recordings. What I found was disturbing. Multiple clips showed Jake in the backyard late at night, conducting what looked like fire experiments in a metal trash can. In one video, dated 3 months before the big incident, Jake was talking to someone on speakerphone while rummaging through my garage. "I'm gonna make life hell for that guy," he said, his voice clear in the recording. "He thinks he can just walk in and play dad. Wait till he sees what I've got planned." The most chilling footage showed him throwing something flaming near the fence several weeks before the main incident, a practice run that thankfully didn't catch. But it proved this wasn't an impulsive act or a one-time mistake. He'd been methodically planning this for months. One video in particular revealed the root of Jake's hatred toward me. He was talking to a friend in the backyard, unaware of the camera's microphone. "You know what that jerk said when he first met me? 'Hi, Jake, from now on, I'm your father.' Like he could just replace my dad just like that. Who does he think he is?" I remembered that first meeting clearly now. I'd been nervous, wanting to make a good impression, trying to show I was committed to being part of their family. I thought saying I wanted to be a father figure would show I was serious about my relationship with Kate and Jake. I had no idea those well-intentioned words would plant such deep seeds of resentment. The evidence was overwhelming. Working with the prosecution, my lawyer compiled the video footage into a comprehensive timeline showing Jake's escalating behavior. There were over 20 incidents of him experimenting with fire in the backyard, 7 instances of him tampering with materials in my garage, and numerous clips of him expressing his intentions to cause damage. When Kate found out about the footage, she exploded. She showed up at my house unannounced, screaming about invasion of privacy and betrayal. "How dare you spy on my son?" she yelled. I reminded her that she'd known about the security cameras. We'd installed them together after the break-ins. But in her mind, I should have deleted the footage to protect Jake, regardless of what it showed. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, running parallel to Jake's criminal case. Kate's initial strategy was aggressive. She tried claiming partial ownership of my house despite having never contributed to it financially. Her lawyer argued that since we'd lived there as a family, she deserved a portion of the equity. My lawyer shut that down fast, producing documentation showing I'd purchased the property years before meeting Kate and had maintained it solely through my income. When that failed, Kate's lawyer tried attacking my financial stability, suggesting that owning a small garage meant I had irregular income. Again, my lawyer was prepared, presenting 3 years of tax returns and business records showing consistent, profitable operation. After these failed attempts, Kate shifted focus to getting the divorce finalized quickly, likely hoping to distance herself from Jake's legal troubles. The emotional toll was immense. I'd married Kate expecting to build a life together, and in less than 2 years, everything had imploded because her son tried to burn down my property. My lawyer suggested filing for a restraining order against Jake, given the video evidence of his escalating behavior. The judge granted a temporary order, preventing him from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. Kate was furious about the restraining order, but I refused to back down. By the time we reached the final stages of divorce negotiations, I was emotionally exhausted but determined to protect myself. The settlement was non-negotiable on certain points. The house remained solely mine, and we included specific language about Jake being prohibited from the property. The criminal case concluded with Jake pleading guilty to attempted arson and criminal mischief. He received 3 years of probation, mandatory counseling, and was ordered to pay restitution for the property damage. According to a mutual friend who attended the sentencing, Jake remained defiant throughout, rolling his eyes as the judge lectured him about the seriousness of his actions. When the divorce was finalized, I felt an odd mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because I was finally free from the constant tension and disrespect, but sad because I truly had loved Kate and wanted our marriage to work. However, the moment she chose to shield Jake from consequences after he nearly destroyed my property, our marriage was effectively over. Looking back, I acknowledge I wasn't perfect. Maybe I could have been more patient, more understanding of the challenges of blending families. But there's no excuse for what Jake did, and I don't regret pressing charges. My parents support my decision, saying Jake needed serious intervention before his behavior escalated further. Some friends suggest I should have tried family counseling instead of legal action, but when someone is actively trying to burn down your property, safety has to come first. The scorch marks on my fence serve as a daily reminder of how quickly life can change. Sometimes I stand there, looking at the damaged post, feeling that familiar knot in my stomach. But I also feel justified in my actions. I protected myself and my property from someone who showed clear intent to cause harm. If that meant the end of my marriage, so be it. The courts agreed that Jake's actions were dangerous and illegal, and I won't apologize for ensuring he faced consequences. If Kate and Jake are angry with me, that's their problem. I'm finally at peace, knowing I don't have to worry about waking up to another accident. Some might say I went too far, others might say I did exactly what was necessary. All I know is I can sleep at night now, and that's worth more than any marriage built on enabling dangerous behavior. Life isn't perfect, and sometimes the people we care about the most can cause the greatest harm. But in the end, I know I did the right thing by standing up for myself. Whatever happens next, I know that I will continue to rebuild and move forward, stronger and wiser than before.